In today's real estate exam prep video, we're going to start a series on real estate vocabulary words. Today I'm going to do 20 of them, and there are a total of 300 that we're going to do over the next several videos. And we're starting right now. Hey everyone, welcome to the Real Estate Classroom YouTube channel, where our mission is simple: to help you pass your real estate exam the first time. My name is Paul Vicheski, and in this particular real estate exam prep video, we're going to start a series on key real estate vocabulary words. Those words, those key terms that you have to know for your real estate licensing exam. We all have a legal name, but we're not all called our legal name. So for example, in real estate, you've heard of the terms landlord, tenant, or the buyer, seller, but they have legal names such as Grantor, Grantee, and Lessor and Lessee. And we have to know those for our real estate exam. And that's why I'm doing this video series. So let's get started here. The first one I want to talk about is agency. Agency is a relationship. It's a legal relationship. And it occurs when one party appoints or hires another party to act on their behalf in a real estate transaction. So maybe the owner engages a property manager to represent their interest. There is a legal agency relationship between those two. Maybe a real estate agent is hired by a seller to sell a piece of property that they have entered into an agency relationship. Or maybe there's a real estate professional that is hired by a buyer to go out and find them a home to buy. Again, agency relationship. It's a relationship, and the agent owes that person that has hired them what's called fiduciary duties. Fiduciary duties. We're not going to talk about that in this particular video, but if you want to check out that video, check it out right here in the upper right-hand corner where we discuss those fiduciary duties. Agent or licensee. Agent or licensee. Those two terms are used interchangeably. In fact, I've seen those two terms used interchangeably in the same real estate exam question. On my broker's exam, the question used the term agent, but the potential answers used the term licensee. They mean the same thing. This is the licensed person, the person that holds a real estate license, whether it's salespersons or broker, it doesn't matter. And again, they represent their client. And when you represent a client, that means there's an agency relationship. That means those fiduciary duties is what the agent or licensee owes their client or principal. The third term is client or principal. Again, those two terms mean the same thing. That's the party who appoints or hires the agent to represent or act on their behalf. The customer is an unrepresented party. Customer, unrepresented party, two terms used interchangeably. That's the party that the agent is working with, but does not have an agency relationship with. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here, because sometimes it gets very confusing for students. On your screen, I have an agent-client relationship, an agency relationship. So the seller has hired the agent to sell the house. Now they have what's called an agency relationship. So the agent owes that seller those fiduciary duties. But let's say the following Sunday, the agent decides to have an open house. So a prospective buyer walks through and says, I want to make an offer on the house, and I want you, Mr. or Mrs. listing agent, to write the offer for me. So the agent makes the disclosure that, hey, I represent the seller. I don't represent you. You are a customer. So the agent who represents the seller is going to also work with the buyer in the same transaction. The difference is the agent owes the seller those fiduciary duties. However, they do not owe those fiduciary duties to the buyer, because that buyer is a customer or an unrepresented person. Now, understand that they don't owe them those fiduciary duties, but they still must treat them with honesty and provide information and good service and those type of things. They can't be misleading or dishonest about things. So here are some other key terms, vocabulary terms you have to know. Number one is offer or offeree. The offeror is the person that's making the offer. The offeree is the person that's receiving that offer. So let's look at a buyer-seller situation. The buyer is making a $100,000 offer on that seller's property. So they are making or giving the offer. So that makes the buyer the offeror. They're the person giving the offer or making the offer. And then the offeree is receiving that offer. And the seller is making or receiving that offer. Now, here's the interesting thing. The buyer is the offeror initially. So the buyer is making the offer of $100,000 on the seller's property. The seller receives that offer. They're the offeree. But the seller wants to counter. So they counter at $125,000. Now they flipped. So now the seller is the offeror and the buyer is the offeree. And it keeps going back and forth every time there's a counter offer that's made. So just remember, the person that's making the offer is the offeror. The person receiving the offer is the offeree. Next two terms, grantor, grantee. The grantor is the seller or the person that is conveying their ownership interest in property. The grantee is the person that's receiving that ownership interest. Again, the next two terms I want to talk about is lessor and lessee. Now, we're all familiar with landlord and tenant. That's the street name, if you will. But they have legal names, and their legal names is lessor and lessee. The lessor is the landlord or the property manager who is authorized to act on behalf of the landlord. And then the lessee is the tenant. So the landlord or property manager is conveying the legal right of possession, not ownership, but the legal right of possession, which are two separate, distinct actual interests in real property. So the landlord's conveying the legal right of possession to the lessee, and that's done by a lease agreement or a lease contract. The person receiving the legal right of possession is the lessee. Lessor, lessee, landlord and tenant. The next two is what's called the vendor and the vendee. So sometimes what happens is a buyer, instead of going to the bank to get the money, they're going to borrow the owner's equity. And we do that using a contract called a land contract, or sometimes referred to as a contract for deed. Land contract, contract for deed are two key real estate terms that you have to know, and they mean the same thing. We're going to discuss those in a different video. But the owner agrees to the seller financing instrument. And what happens is they're going to sign the contract. They are the vendor. They are giving the land contract to the vendee, who is the purchaser. So the seller is the vendor. The purchaser is the vendee. The vendor is giving the land contract. The vendee is receiving the land contract. It's important to understand that in a land contract or contract for deed situation, the owner retains legal title until the terms of the land contract are completed. The vendee receives what's called equitable title, or also known as equitable interest in the property, as well as the legal right of possession. So vendor, vendee, you have to know it for your real estate exam. The next two terms is optionor, optionee. This is when we're talking about option contracts. The optionor is the person who gives the option agreement or option contract, and the optionee is the person who receives it. So let me give you a kind of an example of an option contract very quickly. So let's say there's an owner of a piece of property and someone wants to buy it, but they don't qualify for the loan for the next 6 months. So maybe they just started a new job and the lender says they have to be at that job for 5 or 6 months before they can count their income is verifiable income. So the optionee doesn't want to lose that house to somebody else, or the buyer doesn't want to lose that house. So they enter into what's called an option contract. So the owner gives the option to the buyer that says, listen, I'm going to charge you a fee, maybe called an option fee. So for $500, $1,000, whatever, I promise not to sell the house for 6 months, so you can get, your qualifications with the lender. At the end of 6 months, you either have to buy it or I'm going to sell it to somebody else. That's an option contract. The buyer has the option. Okay, so they have legal names. The optionor is the owner who's giving the option. The optionee is the buyer who is receiving the option agreement. Optionor, Optionee. The next two terms you have to be familiar with is Assignor and Assignee. Now, let me give you an example where we would see this. Let's say that I enter into a purchase contract with a seller to purchase a piece of property, but I haven't closed yet. I have what's called equitable interest in that property because if I go through with the terms of the contract, I'm going to close in 3, 4, 5 weeks or whatever the contract calls for at a specific price, etc. So let's say you're my neighbor and you say, Paul, I really wanted to buy that house. You beat me to it. And I say, listen, I'm not married to the house. I don't care if you want it. You can buy it. So instead of me going and canceling the contract and this person, my neighbor, going and enter into a contract, I just simply assign my contract over to my neighbor. That's called an assignment of contract. So keep this in mind that all contracts with the exception of a listing contract is assignable unless the contract specifically says that it's not. On the leasing side, we call this subleasing or subletting. All real estate contracts are assignable with the exception of a listing contract. So I have the purchase contract with the seller. My neighbor wants it. My neighbor and I are going to enter into what's called an assignment contract where I'm going to be the assigner and I'm going to assign my interest in this purchase contract to my neighbor. My neighbor is the assignee. I am the assignor because I am giving or assigning my interest in that purchase contract to my neighbor, and my neighbor is receiving that interest that I have in that purchase contract. Assignor, assignee. Mortgagor, mortgagee. This is used, or these two terms are used in mortgage states. Mortgage states where, like Iowa, for example, uses mortgages. Where I'm at in Nebraska, we're a deed state, so we use a deeded trust. So in states that are mortgage states, you're going to have the mortgagor, mortgagee. The mortgagor is the borrower. They are the owner of the property that's putting that property up as collateral or as security for a mortgage so they can get that mortgage from the bank. The mortgagee is the lender or the bank. They're the ones that are holding the mortgage or holding the collateral, which is the property, in case the mortgagor defaults, and then it allows the mortgagee or the lender to go in and do a foreclosure. So the mortgagor is the borrower, the mortgagee is the lender. The way I remembered this when I was a student sitting where you are is there are 2 E's in mortgagee. So that's how I remembered it. 2 E's in lender, 2 E's in mortgagee. And then finally, I need to talk about a deed of trust. Again, some states are mortgage states where we have the mortgagor, mortgagee, but in many states, in most states, it's a deed of trust. So we're going to have 3 parties, the trustor, the trustee, and the beneficiary. And let me kind of explain how this happens. So I purchase a piece of property. So what happens is the seller conveys title or ownership to me at closing, but I'm borrowing the money and we are a deed of trust state where I'm at. So simultaneously, what happens after I receive title or ownership, I then immediately transfer title to a trustee. So therefore, then the bank will then fund the transaction. So once that happens, there are 3 parties involved. The trustor is me. I'm the original owner. I receive that ownership interest from the seller. But as soon as that happened, because I borrowed the money from the bank, simultaneously, I then transferred title to the trustee. I'm the trustor. I have an equitable interest in the property, but that trustee is the legal title holder because I transferred the title. The bank is the beneficiary. They are the lender because they borrowed the money. So here's what happens. If I, as the trustor, stop making the payments, the beneficiary, who is the lender, is going to call the trustee who has legal title, and they're going to say, hey, you need to foreclose because Paul has not been making the mortgage payments. And that's what happens. The trustee, because they're the legal title holder, they end up doing the foreclosure. Now, if I pay off the promissory note in full, Then the trustee will transfer title to me, and then I become the legal title holder. So that's what happens in deed states. I have a video on that as well. If you want to explore that, I'm going to put the link right up here in the upper right-hand corner. So, okay, that's it for this video and the first 20 vocabulary words. If you want to continue studying vocabulary words, check out this video right here. If you have not subscribed to the channel, please do so. Click the little circle to my left. Comments and questions down below, would appreciate it. See you in the next video.